Chapter 9, Serena's Laboratory, 2001. A soft, long inhalation of breath, a pause of 30 seconds, then the long, slow exhale. Serena sat cross-legged on the steel table, her eyes half closed as she breathed. Attending to her breathing helped to center her, allowing her to ignore the pain. Her lap filled with blood as her hands worked, slicing into the skin of her abdomen, sliding out the small parcels that contain the neural net processors and power cells that would activate her small army of T-101s. The diminutive plastic-wrapped processors were a new generation, more advanced than the chips that had activated her teachers. These were smaller, slimmer, and even more efficient, as were the power cells, 3 to each Terminator, one of Skynet's innovations, introduced just before she'd left. For all their lightweight and smaller design, Serena would be glad to be rid of them. She had been constantly aware of them just beneath the surface of her skin, and concerned that she might damage them in some way. But with no safe place to store them, she'd kept them close. Now she possessed the equivalent of a vault. Serena paused in her work and looked around the long, narrow room. It was approximately 30 feet long and 14 feet wide, with the ceiling 6 feet 6 inches from the floor. Neither she nor the machines she'd be creating needed the psychological comfort of a ceiling high above their heads. Brightened by banks of fluorescent lights, gleaming steel tables, and glassed door cabinets, it made a pleasant place to work. True, it still stank of the anti-magnetic white paint she'd used, but the air scrubber was doing an excellent job of thinning the fumes. Across the room, the heads of 2 T-101s, propped on a steel table, grinned at her with demented glee. The backs of their gleaming skulls were open and waiting for the gifts of life and intelligence. Her fingers twitched with eagerness to get back to work. She picked up the scalpel and made another cut. It's a little like giving birth, actually, she thought, and smiled with grim humor. Beside her, the culture-growing vats she'd adapted hummed contentedly as they grew flesh for her new subordinates. In the far corner of the room, well out of the way, 2 hulking, headless metal skeletons stood, their large, intricate hands hanging by their sides. Already in place was the delicate system of nutrient pumps and the fine net of permeable plastic capillaries that would feed the Terminator's coating of skin and flesh. Beside them were the large tanks in which they would lie, washed in a nutrient broth, while their new skin surface grew around them. The muscles needed to animate the T-101's faces with their self-contained nervous system were also progressing nicely. These would interact directly with the T-101's neural net processor for the maximum effect. She'd had some trouble with the eyes, though. For now, they would be given glass eyes, which would pass muster behind sunglasses. She'd have to correct that flaw as soon as possible. Details were important. Of course, the Terminators could be useful even without a coating of skin, so she'd given herself a head start on them. Now that the lab was constructed, she was eager to move into high gear, and the extra hands would be most welcome. Tomorrow, finally, she was to start her job at Cyberdine. It would be necessary to leave the biotech work to the T-101s. Not that they'd have much to do for several days, beyond minding the cultivators, and learning how to function unobtrusively here. Blending in was part of their programming, but the more they were exposed to people, the better they functioned. But in order for them to do anything, they had to have brains. That meant that tonight, she would have to test out each chip to 10/10ths capacity. Otherwise, she dared not let the Terminators work alone. She slipped out the last package. It was almost a sensual feeling. Moist, slippery, the hot feel of plastic in her hand, the sense of slackness where she'd been filled. Serena laid the package down on the table beside the others. Then she swabbed her abdomen with alcohol, feeling wicked for lavishing it on as she was. It spilled over her legs and puddled red on the table beneath her. At home, the stuff was hoarded like gold was here. She thought of the humans there who suffered infection and pain because they lacked this simple, abundant stuff, and she was pleased. She found that she liked the 21st century. The cuts, while superficial, were deep enough to sting and burn where the alcohol touched them. Serena looked down at herself. She was designed to be a quick healer, and already the loose flesh where the packages had been stored was returning to smoothness. The flow of blood slowed. Simple bandages, she decided, would do. When she'd seen to her cuts, Serena hopped off the table. The alcohol running down her legs dried cool. She swabbed down the table and disposed of the paper towels she'd used. Then, drawing out a chair at her workstation, she began testing the chips. After the first one, she let out a relieved breath. It had survived the trip through time unscathed. That had been the one thing that had truly worried her, that these irreplaceable elements might have been fried by the transfer's wild electronic convulsions. One at least had made it. She wouldn't have to do this completely by herself. 3 hours later, she sat back, well satisfied with her work. One of the processors hadn't made it, but the accompanying power cells were still perfect. Skynet itself had predicted a pessimistic 75% success rate, so this was a victory of sorts. Choosing one of the Terminator heads, Serena set to work. She would allow her internal computer to program it while the meat part of her rested on one of the tables nearby. Then, tomorrow, while she was at Cyberdine, it would complete its partner and watch the cultures. She was pleased. She had won the job at Cyberdine. Her background had held up under extremely close scrutiny, and soon Cyberdine would begin work on those completely automated munitions factories that Skynet had designed. That was step one in the larger plan that would eliminate the humans. The factories hadn't existed in fully exploitable form when Skynet was first activated in the original timeline. Theoretically, the automated factories should also swell the ranks of those who objected to the unbridled expansion of technology, who, oddly enough, were often Skynet's most willing allies. Humans were very strange creatures. She would have the T-101s complete 2 more of themselves for the next task. The lab was regrettably small after all. Once they could be trusted to interact with humans, she could safely move them upstairs. Dyson's house was large enough to accommodate several Terminators easily. But from now on, if their programming went as it should, they could be left in complete control of this aspect of the operation. Then, as soon as possible, she would send one off to acquire a remote site that could be used as a safe house in the event that she needed to bolt. That likelihood was remote in her opinion, but Skynet's insistence on a backup plan was deeply ingrained. So much to do, she thought with pleasure, and, starting in the morning, Skynet would be under her protection. The thought filled her with the closest thing to joy her cold heart could experience. Then she paused. I'm enjoying more success in this time period than any of the previous agents, she thought. But is that because I'm more capable? Or is it because, unlike them, I am mainly attempting to preserve the original sequence of events? That would not be good enough. The original sequence of events produced Skynet, and its ultimate defeat at the hands of John Connor and the humans. Cyberdine, 2001. So, thrill me, Miss Burns, Tricker said sarcastically. Tell me how you're going to make Cyberdine safe for democracy. The cheap round conference table could seat up to 10, but there were only 4 here today. The president, CEO, Burns, and Tricker. Tricker glanced at Warren, who was nervously tapping the conference table with a pen. The president instantly stopped. Serena looked at the government liaison with a controlled expression of someone examining the boss's obnoxious 2-year-old set loose in the middle of an important meeting. She glanced at the 2 nervous executives and smiled reassuringly at them. Before she answered, Serena let her eyes briefly take in the rest of the room. Wherever the money went in building this place, it sure didn't go into the decor, she thought. You could tell this was a government operation. Billions in, squalor out. The air smelled of concrete and had the faint, not quite odor of a large-scale recycling unit. Well, she said at last, her voice laced with gentle patience. I think I should point out that Cyberdine isn't a democracy. Like every other successful business, this is a hierarchy. She folded her hands in front of her primly. But in regard to security, my own personal feeling is that it should be closer to a tyranny than either an oligarchy or a democracy. She smiled at the fixed expressions that settled onto the faces of the CEO and president of Cyberdine. Obviously, that's impossible, she said, especially when dealing with geniuses and freewheeling engineering types. So what I'll try to do is exercise as much control as possible without making anyone feel constricted. As they listened, Colvin and Warren were already beginning to look less constricted. Very nice speech, Miss Burns, Tricker said after a moment. Allow me to rephrase the question. Just what do you plan to do to make Cyberdine safe? Serena raised an eyebrow. I'll start with the basics. First, I'll find out just what Cyberdine is currently doing, then I'll draw up a plan of action based on any improvements I think are necessary. Next, I'll familiarize myself with the company's personnel records, see if anyone deserves a slightly closer look into their background, then I'll interview the more important scientists first, as well as the executives. She smiled at Warren and Colvin, to see what sort of personal security they have in place. That, I think, should keep me busy for a while. Once I know more, I'll be able to tell you more. Serena looked directly at Tricker and regaled him with an idiot grin. I'm sorry, I can't be more specific, but right off the top of my empty blonde head, that's the best I'm willing to do. He stared at her for a moment, unsmiling. Where do you plan to start looking? He asked. I'm going to check the computers, she answered promptly. See to it that there are no modems in unsecured computers. Make sure that the staff all understand the drill on securing their machines. No disks in or out, that sort of thing. I'll combine it with an introducing myself to the staff tour. That starts as soon as this meeting is over. Colvin cleared his throat. They all looked at him. Do you have something for me? He asked her. Serena put her attache case on the table and removed a small plastic box, which she slid across to him. Tricker took it all in with a most interested expression on his face, but held his peace. Colvin opened the box. Warren leaned close to look into it with him. Then they both visibly relaxed. Tricker's brow went up. He turned to the I-950, who returned his inquisitive look with one of bland amusement. This, Colvin said, tapping the box on the table, represents Miles Dyson's last work for the company. Serena crossed her legs and folded her hands over her flat stomach, all her attention apparently on the CEO. But she caught the look of genuine startlement that flashed across Tricker's face before his usual sardonic expression returned. Miss Burns brought me a disc that contained a sampler from each of these, but there was plenty there to convince me that this was a valuable resource and that Cyberdine had to have it. Tricker turned to look at Serena. You blackmailed them into hiring you? She gave a delicate little shudder. Blackmail is such a harsh word, she said. Is there a better one? He asked, leaning forward, giving the two executives a disgusted look. Serena considered the ceiling for a moment, then lowered her eyes to his. No, but then blackmail isn't the right word either. She straightened up in her seat and faced Tricker directly. Look, I'm young for this job, and I'm a woman. That's 2 strikes against me. I could see who my competition was, and it didn't take me long to realize that your choice definitely had the inside track. She shrugged. I had an ace, and I played it. As far as I'm concerned, anyone who held that card would have done the same thing. She tilted her head and widened her blue eyes at him. Unless you think I should have sent those discs to Dyson's family? Where exactly did you get them? Tricker asked. His pose was relaxed, but he was anything but. The government liaison was not pleased that the 2 executives had held out on him, and he wondered just how long they'd known about this. And how do we know they're genuine? Serena looked at Colvin and Warren instead of answering. She bought Dyson's old house, Colvin said, and found the discs hidden there. I assure you they're genuine. Not only are they written in Dyson's style, but they contain information about his work, and ours, that couldn't be obtained from any other source than Dyson himself. The way you guys keep house, I'd hate to bet the farm on that, Tricker sneered. He turned to Serena. Miss Burns, where exactly did you find these? He gestured to the package in Colvin's hands. In the garage, she said. She found a nice, unobtrusive little cubbyhole up in the rafters that she thought might have been overlooked. They were tucked away up high. Tricker studied her for a moment. Am I to understand that you went looking for something like this deliberately? Oh yes, I've worked with scientists and engineers since I got out of college. They value their work and they like to back it up. Frequently, they use little hiding places for their discs. She shrugged. It's just something that some of them do. Uh-huh. Tricker let the silence stretch as his cold gaze moved from person to person. I assume I'll be receiving copies of these discs? That, of course, is up to the president and CEO, Serena answered. If they deem it appropriate, then of course you will." If Tricker was startled by her boldness, he gave no sign. He resettled himself in his chair, folding his hands on his stomach, and looked at Serena through narrowed eyes. "And what would you have done, Miss Burns, had Cyberdine not hired you?" "Well," she said brightly, "I had 4 options. To sell the discs either to Cyberdine," she tipped her head at Colvin and Warren, "or to some other interested party. Or I could have sent them on to Miles Dyson's family, who certainly would seem to have a legitimate claim to them. Or I could simply have destroyed them." "What's your story?" Tricker turned his cold blue gaze on the executives. "We were afraid you'd screw it up," Colvin said evenly. "Well, that's flattering." The government liaison sneered. "Not very," Serena said mildly. "But I surmise that without interference, you would be the one making the final decision. So I moved to circumvent that. You were unavailable, but I sensed that you'd already made up your mind. So I approached Mr. Colvin, and here we are." There was silence for a moment while they looked at one another. Colvin and Warren regarded the other two warily. Tricker suddenly smacked the table with his hand, making the executives jump. "The little girl knows how to play hardball," he said, looking almost pleased. "She does indeed," Serena assured him. "What if I said that I didn't like the way you do business and told you that we weren't hiring you after all?" Tricker asked. "Then I would have badly miscalculated," the I-950 replied serenely. "Is that your intention?" "I'll have to get back to you on that," he said with what might have been a smile. "Take your time," Serena told him. Office, CDF, Serena Burns, Executive Head of Security, 2001. Wanted, Assistant Head of Security at Cyberdine Systems. Some law enforcement background preferred. FBI experience ideal. Excellent benefits. Pay commensurate with experience. Inquire. That should reel him in. Serena had asked for an assistant more to test her muscle than because she needed one. The meeting had broken up rather inconclusively, with Tricker's last words hanging in the air like a bad smell. Using what she knew of human psychology, she decided to make demands and spend money, assuming that it would make them reluctant to fire her, at least at first. She'd already improved the decor of her small office. The new blue carpet was deep-piled, and her desk was both better-looking and more efficient than its predecessor. The new desk chair was so comfortable that one could sleep in it. But the original computer was first-rate, and she'd kept it. A narrow glass coffee table abutted a small white leather couch along one wall, over which was a painting of blue herons rising from a lake. The painting was hers. She had bought it because she thought it hinted at vulnerability and femininity. It was always best to keep humans off balance. As for the assistant, if she was going to have one, and it wasn't going to be a Terminator, neither of hers was ready yet. Both being rather raw-looking, it might as well be Miles Dyson's brother. She'd become aware of him while she was looking into Cyberdine and the terrorist attack that had destroyed its earlier facility. Intrigued, she'd examined his record at the FBI. It seemed that he had often risked incurring the wrath of his superiors in order to continue to look into his brother's death. So, she'd hacked into his personal and work computer and examined his files, followed his tracks on the internet, and had been impressed with what she'd found. Jordan Dyson possessed a single-mindedness that she'd so far found to be a rare commodity in humans. Alone, he'd tracked the Connors south of the border all the way to Brazil. There, the trail had ended. More than one of his contacts had written with great assurance that the Connors were dead. Still, he continued to pursue them. It was something pointless in a way. Bringing Miles' killers to justice would not restore his brother to life, and his reputation was safe. Miles Dyson had been exonerated in the attack because of his wife's testimony that she and their son were being held hostage while he led the terrorists to Cyberdine. The insurance companies were satisfied enough to promptly pay his family a death benefit. As far as the FBI was concerned, the case on Miles Dyson was closed, and after so many years, with no reported sightings of either of them, the Connors files were permanently at the bottom of the pile. Except for Special Agent Jordan Dyson, that is. He still spent a few hours each week trying to find something out about their whereabouts and current activities. She knew he was aware of Cyberdine's new address and its renewed interest in his brother's work. A dated note on his computer said, "Miles Project." He checked the advertisement for a head of security several times. Serena suspected that he thought the reopening of his brother's project would bring the Connors out of hiding, as do I, and he will be helpful in seeing that they are stopped, which gives us something in common. He could be very useful under the right circumstances, which meant directly under her control. Otherwise, he could be a loose cannon. She sent out the ad with the touch of a key. If he didn't call in the next week or so, she'd contact him. The I-950 doubted he'd be able to resist the lure of unlimited time to search for his brother's killers.
Wilmington, Delaware, 2001.
Wanted. Assistant Head of Security at Cyberdine Systems. Some law enforcement background preferred. FBI experience ideal. Excellent benefits. Pay commensurate with experience. Inquire. Jordan could feel the blood drain from his face. My God, he thought. It's like they're looking for me. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the screen. His compact living room/office was dark except for the small pool of light cast by his desk lamp. Jordan liked it that way. There were fewer distractions. He pushed himself up out of his chair and began to pace rapidly through the shadowed room, rubbing his chin and brushing his hand over his close-clipped hair. This was perfect, like a call to action, like a message from God even. He stopped, his eyes gazing into a possible future. He saw himself on hand when the murdering Connors were finally captured. He was the one to put the cuffs on the big cop killer who hung out with them. A pleasant image, but he knew he'd be better off trying to figure out how he could explain his plans to his boss. Ideally, he'd get permission to go undercover at Cyberdine to wait for the Connors and whomever they'd recruited. Unfortunately, that would be a conflict of interest. Besides, everyone at the Bureau was convinced that the Connors had died in the Brazilian jungle. Their big friend had disappeared even before they hit the border. Whether he was dead or had merely deserted them was unknown. Whatever. The upshot was that he'd be attempting to convince his superior to allow him to go undercover to wait for people who were considered dead. The Bureau would think he was nuts. Jordan briefly toyed with the idea of saying he needed time off to get his head together, then taking the Cyberdine job. He rejected the idea at once. Lying to your supervisor was the best and quickest way he knew to get yourself fired. That left quitting. Jordan sat heavily in his armchair, his hand over his eyes. I don't want to quit. He loved his job. He liked the people he worked with. He even liked the Bureau and its stodgy, ultra-respectable air. He sighed and dropped his hand. Leaning his head against the chair back, he looked at the room. Very masculine, with a leather sofa and chairs in dark brown, clunky mission-end tables, and a trunk for a coffee table. He liked his apartment. He liked this city. He clutched the heavily padded arms of his chair. I like my job. But if I work for Cyberdine, I'll be living near Danny and Teresa. He liked to be there for his nephew. 12 was an age when a boy needed a man's influence. So, what it comes down to is this. What are you willing to sacrifice to get your brother's killers? So far, he'd neatly skirted that issue. Oh, he'd gotten himself into trouble, of a sort. His record at the Bureau was peppered with reprimands for spending too much time on a dead case, or for being involved in it at all, actually. He was considered, legitimately, to be too close to the subject of the investigation. But if I quit and this works out the way I think it will, then there's a chance I might be able to get myself reinstated. The phone rang, and he grabbed it like a lifeline. Dyson, he said shortly. Teresa's warm chuckle greeted him. You sound like an old-time detective when you answer the phone like that, she said. Hey, just trying to keep up my G-Man image. What's up, sis? There was a pause. Everything's all right? He asked immediately. Nothing's wrong, she answered. But we want to talk to you, Jordan. When can you come out here? We'd like it to be face-to-face. Oh, uh-huh. That sounds like nothing's wrong, all right. He thought for a moment. Danny's not getting into drugs, is he? Oh, God, no, she said, sounding both amused and disgusted. He's fine. It's about something else entirely. She waited a moment. So, when could you... I'll talk to my supervisor tomorrow, he said. How urgent is this? Will Thursday be soon enough? More than soon enough. Thank you, Jordan. No problem. See you Thursday then. Okay, thanks. Talk to you then. He hung up. She'd sounded so nervous at the end. What the hell was that all about? He felt a little worry about Danny, despite Teresa's reassurance. He felt energized and wished he could get on a plane right now. Not possible, of course, but the desire burned bright. But man, talk about a sign. If he'd been the kind of guy to ask for such a thing, this had to be it. He sat at his desk and brought up his resume, then sent it off to Cyberdine with a request for an appointment on Friday. He was about to sign off when the answer came back. Jordan's jaw dropped. An appointment has been made for you with Miss Serena Burns, Executive Head of Security of Cyberdine Systems Corporation, at 3 p.m. on Friday the 23rd. There were travel instructions to the facility with information about the high-grade security procedures he would have to follow in order to gain access to Cyberdine. Hey, he thought, maybe they really were looking for me. With a few taps, he downloaded the information they'd sent and printed it out. Nah, either I'm getting paranoid or my ego is swollen. They probably have a program set up to answer applications. This was Cyberdine after all. If a computer can't do it, it can't be done incorporated. So, things were really moving now. He'd better remember to bring a couple of boxes to work tomorrow, just in case he needed to clean out his desk. For now, he'd better turn in and try to get some sleep. He shut down the computer and tried to shut down his mind. Bed, he thought. Let tomorrow take care of itself.